Good evening, everybody. I'm Blair Hartley, the Director of Development at Film and Lincoln Center, and we are delighted you have joined us this evening for the discussion of Summerland with Director Jessica Swale, Gugu Mbata Raw, and Gemma Arterton, and moderated by Tiffany Vasquez, editor at Giphy and curating all film content there. And I hope you all enjoyed Summerland. We would like to thank our friends at IFC Films for making the screening of Summerland and tonight's Q&A possible, and also American Airlines, the official airline of Film at Lincoln Center, for its year-round support, as well as the Blanche and Irving Laurie Foundation for their year-round support. Now, more importantly, before we begin, I must thank Campari for being our presenter of this exceptional patron event. And also, I personally hope that all of you took advantage of the Negroni recipe that Campari provided for all of us. It's of course, quite delicious. Earlier this week, you should have heard that Chloe Zhao's Nomadland, starring Frances McDormand, was selected as the centerpiece of this year's New York Film Festival. Please do keep your eyes on your email over the next week or two, because there are going to be many festival announcements that will be coming out. It's going to be an exciting year. And then make sure to check out our virtual cinema too. New films open every Friday. This Friday, it's Koji Fukada's A Girl Missing, their newest selection. So please join in for that. And finally, most importantly, tonight would not be possible without the commitment of our patrons. So thank you to each and every one of you who has joined us tonight for your continued support. During these times, it is absolutely crucial, and we thank each and every one of you. Now, without any further ado, I'm going to turn things over to our moderator, Tiffany Vasquez.
Hello, everyone. Hi, patrons. I'm so glad to continue to celebrate movies with you in every way possible that we can right now. And I'm so privileged to be here with director Jessica Swale, stars Gemma Arterton and Gugu Mbata Raw, to discuss Summerland. We've all got our Negronis ready and ready to talk about this very warm, comforting and lovely movie. I'm gonna ask some questions for about half an hour, and then we'll take some questions from you all a little bit after that. So get them ready. And we'll start with Jessica. Obviously, we want to know just how this story came about, how long is it in the making, and just how did it get made?
Oh, a whole host of questions. I began writing this probably 5 years ago. And I was a theatre director originally, and then a writer in the theatre. I really hadn't ever really thought about making movies. I adored the cinema, but I cut my teeth in the theatre, and I was so happy working there. I hadn't really expected to jump across, but actually BAFTA were very generous in sort of providing a bursary, and they were looking for writers who were working in other media and to tempt over to write for the screen. And that's because they felt that there was a bit of a lack sometimes of original storytelling in cinema, because a lot of writers coming up, the opportunities were to write part of a franchise or to write something based on a book or something that was already successful. And it's really important to tell stories from scratch. And so I was chosen to be one of those writers. And so I literally started with a blank piece of paper, which is really unusual. For the most part, you know, you begin with a kernel of something or a clue. There's a character in a newspaper or someone you've met or something you read about in history, but their challenge was this cannot be based on an idea you've had before. You have to start with nothing at all. So I began by asking myself, why write for the screen? What can cinema do that we don't do in other modes of storytelling and that I couldn't necessarily do on the stage? And I started thinking, well, when I want to go to the cinema, I want to escape and I want to be transported. And the joy of the sort of visual landscape of what cinema can do is that you can do anything and you can make magic. And I love magic realism. And I find that notion that something small just outside our normal reality existing, I find that really exciting and kind of magical and a bit sexy and mysterious. And I thought it'd be lovely to tell a story where that was the case. For me, the sort of science fiction end of that was a bit of a leap, but but telling a story of reality with just a tinge or a hint of something else is much more sort of tonally satisfying for me. So I started thinking about magic, and that led me to think about folklore and myths and legends. And actually, the other part of it was that Brexit was just beginning when I started thinking about what was important to me. And it made me think about the fact that I'm English. And for the first time, I felt actually really quite uncomfortable and embarrassed about what English meant. I thought it felt quite racist. It felt something that could be sort of associated with a nationalism or cutting ourselves off. And I felt really disappointed about that, because actually I loved being English, but I needed to identify what that meant and what it was that I loved about this country, in a sort of not George and the Dragon kind of a way, in a not, National Front kind of a way. And I thought, actually, what I love about the idea of England is the sort of the land, the ancient land, and the Cornish coast, and the stories, and Stonehenge, and old graveyards, and the idea that people have been here forever and a day. And what are those stories, and where do they come from? And who might I be if I was investigating that? And that led me to create Alice. So that's a very long-winded answer in answer to your question about where the story came from.
But a beautiful answer nonetheless. And so then, Gemma, how did you become involved, and what about Alice do you love playing?
So I became involved in a very sort of non-traditional way. So I have a production company that looks for female-led content. And so somebody had told me about Summerland, and Jess and I had worked together on a play called Nell Gwyn, and so we'd gotten to know each other on that. And so I said, oh, will you send me this film Summerland? I've heard about it. And this was not as an actress, this is just me as a producer looking for content. And all I knew about it was that it was about an older woman and a young boy in the 1940s. And so Jess sent it to me. I knew nothing about it, which is the best way of going about watching this film or reading it, as I was at the time. And Alice was originally written older than me, so not my playing age. So I was not considering it as an actress at all, even when reading it. But loved it. It just took my breath away, and I thought it was so clear and beautifully realized. Even in the script, I could see the world that Jess wanted to make. And so after reading it and crying a lot, and that never happens, by the way, when reading scripts. I'm like stone cold usually, but this one really got me. And so I called Jess and said, let's make this, and you have to direct it. And then she eventually said, well, you should play Alice, and I'll adapt it so that Alice is a bit younger, so you can play it, which was an amazing opportunity for me, because Alice is such in comparison to the roles that I've previously played, quite a departure. And I loved how, unapologetically cantankerous and difficult she is. And there are obviously reasons for that. You learn about her heartbreak and how she's been sort of abandoned in life, and she's protecting herself from all of that by being the most difficult person to be around. But I loved that, and that even though, and I think at the time I was really aware of this whole likable female lead thing, which just, drives me up the wall. So I thought, oh yes, at last, a great character that is, not maternal, not kind to children, not, she's difficult, and yet there was so much wit in there that you couldn't help but like her, or want to watch her, or find her amusing in some way. So that was why I was just, so flattered that Jess would want me to play her.
Yes, absolutely. And I love her character so much. So then, Gugu, how did you become involved, and what did you love about playing Vera?
Yeah, well, I've known Jess for a long, long time. And like Gemma, we've worked together in theatre on the same play, but in different productions, which is kind of, rarely, rarely happens. And I've been such a fan of Jess as a human and as an artist, in the theatre world. And so I knew that Jess was developing this script through BAFTA and, moving from theatre to film and screenwriting. And initially, I think that Jess just told me about the story before I'd really had a chance to read it. And I just thought it was so original and really moving when she pitched it to me and described the whole world. I just found it really just special and emotional and unique. And so that was sort of probably a couple of years before the actual film, was still being developed. And then, much later on, I knew that Gemma was producing it and that they had worked together to get the film off the ground. And when Jess invited me to play Vera, I was kind of surprised because I knew she was so excited about it, but I didn't know that she had envisioned me to be in it. So, similarly to Gemma, I was, I kind of looked at it quite objectively, as a sort of piece, without my contribution. And I was just thrilled, to be able to be a part of Jess's first film, and such a beautiful story, and like she said, such an interesting way to look at Britain and historically and all the layers and the twists and turns in the story. And having worked quite a lot in America the last few years, it was really special and refreshing for me to do something that felt so thoroughly British in its themes and such a fun, vibrant character to play.
Yeah. When I was watching Summerland, some parts of it did remind me a little bit about a movie called Come Away, which you are also in.
Oh.
And so did you feel like there was sort of a little bit of a similarity in terms of a magical quality also with that?
That's really interesting. So Come Away is a film that was produced by David Oyelowo and is based on sort of the fairy tale of, I guess, Alice in Wonderland and Peter Pan. That's so interesting because I filmed them actually very close together. I mean, Come Away, I only did, one day on that film. I played the older Alice in Wonderland once she's grown up. So, spoiler alert. But basically, they were happening at the same time, and I think, that's really interesting. I didn't really think of them as similar in a way, but I know what you mean in terms of the idea of storytelling and in terms of the idea of things from a child's perspective, but I felt like that, certainly for my character and for Vera, this was, a very different journey in terms of the love story and in terms of, how Vera appears, from Alice's perspective, in sort of flashback. And so that's interesting that you make that comparison. I hadn't really thought about it.
Well, this one is for Gemma and Gugu. Is it almost a relief to play original characters in period pieces as opposed to characters in biopics or adaptations, which are normally what we would expect from period pieces?
I would say yes. I haven't done that many, but I definitely feel like you can, obviously you can just do whatever, you don't have to sort of do an imitation or impersonation or whatever, people call it, an embodiment or whatever they call it. I just love that. But at the same time, I'm playing Dusty Springfield in something in the future, and that's something that I'm really excited about because I feel like there's so much of her that's not known. So there's so much more that I could bring to her, aside from her performance, and the way that people knew her through her performance. They didn't really know anything about her as a person. So in that sense, I'd feel a little bit more free with that. But yeah, I mean, it's just a whole nother another thing that you don't have to worry about when they haven't lived or don't live now, offending anybody or, you know, misrepresenting anybody. So I personally feel like it's a freedom.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I found it very liberating, and I think, you know, and I think that the essence of Vera is very free as well. So that was great. And also, interestingly, at the same time as we were shooting this, I was also preparing for a film called Misbehavior, in which I do play a real life person, and she's not as well known as someone like Dusty Springfield, but she's a real woman that I met pretty much 2 weeks after I wrapped shooting Summerland, you know, and it's a different responsibility, I think, you know, when you're playing somebody that's really lived. And, you know, this character in that film was you know, the first woman of color to play Miss World, and you know, she had a huge amount of notoriety and fame at that time, you know, so you're looking back and you want to honor that person, I think. But I think there's a difference between when you're playing someone that really exists, you know, it's not a documentary, you're not doing an impersonation, you want to honor them, but you don't necessarily, you want them to like it, obviously, but your intention is not to please them, it's to honor the story always, you know, ultimately. So yeah, and in this, I think, you know, knowing that it had come from Jess's imagination, but it was also the themes were hugely personal to Jess and her life, and that I felt like even though Vera wasn't a real person, I felt that there was so much of Jess in the story, and because we know each other so well, you know, there's so much of her in all the characters. So yeah, I just found it very freeing to play Vera, especially, and I think, you know, whenever a character is, you know, completely fictional like that, it gives you a lot more freedom to create.
Absolutely. Reminder to the patrons, type any questions in if you have any, but I've certainly got more. Jessica, you've talked a little bit about this already, but there's so much to tie together between the location of the film and the magical realism. Did it have to be Kent? Was it actually filmed in Kent, by the way? And did it have to be in this place because it ties so much to the just mythological aspects?
What was important to me was that it was a landscape that we could fall in love with and that would inspire something sort of in our souls that made you feel like magic might really exist. And I think in a sense that could be anywhere. The reason why Kent is referenced in the story is because when I was doing my research, I came across a very obscure book and an article in the book which was about Fata Morgana and these islands that people had seen over time in lots of different places. And one piece of the kind of clue of the references was the fact that there was an article written at the end of the 1800s in a newspaper from Kent saying that the people of Ramsgate had been looking out to sea and they'd seen Dover Castle, which is around the next cliff, floating out on the sea. And that really, really happened. You know, which was kind of very odd, but of course it's a mirage. It's about reflection and refraction, and that's the first time I've been able to say those two words without hodging them together. It's a bit of a tongue twister. The Negroni obviously helps. Who knew? But yeah, I found that article and thought, this is really interesting. You know, this is something which perhaps could tie into the notion of people seeing an idea of heaven, which made me investigate the notion of heaven across culture and in different traditions. And that's when I started looking at pagan heaven and found this idea of Summerland. And Summerland is actually, I hodged it a little bit in the film, but the notion of it is essentially a sort of land on top of ours, which already exists, which people who've passed away could somehow communicate with or see the world as it is. And I loved that idea. And I liked the idea that if you were in Summerland, maybe even if we couldn't see you, perhaps you could leave patterns or move sticks around and show people a sign to give them hope that death wasn't the end. And so there was something about that part of the world that is so beautiful that it seemed like it would be a really sensible place to set the film. And so when we were scouting, we actually looked all over the country, and really the reason for filming there very specifically was because that's where we found the hero house, the house that's in the film. And I had thought that I had such a specific idea of what that house ought to be in my head that we were going to have to build it. I was a bit worried we were going to have to add an extra £1 million into the budget in order to build a set, because I thought there's no way we're going to find a house which, you know, in the script I described it so particularly in terms of the wind chimes and the edge of the world and the cliffs and the way the water hits the rocks underneath it, and thought, well, how would that exist? And then found that house, and couldn't quite believe. I was really emotional actually when we went to see it, because I thought, this is the house in my head. I wrote this house. This is so strange. Someone's built the house that it was only part of my imagination. And we were very, very lucky, because actually the woman that owns that house, the exterior of it had been used a number of times for locations, but no one had ever been allowed to shoot inside, not a whole movie, because she didn't want to sort of give the house up for 2 months and move out, quite rightly. But we sent her the script and said, oh, just read it just in case. And she came straight back and she said, I can't believe it. This house, it feels like you wrote this story for my house. And I said, well, it feels like your house was created for this story. So can we? Yeah. And it was just a really lovely sort of moment of a beautiful coincidence, but yeah, a joyous thing to be able to work there. But it's sort of, I feel like it's a story that I hope is universal, and as much as it's about English folklore, it's actually about hope and the possibilities of something beyond. And I think that in a way it could have been set anywhere with a sort of mystical tradition.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I agree completely. So there are several aspects of the relationship in this movie. Two women start a relationship in the 1920s, and it's an interracial relationship. Yeah. And I feel like most pictures would take the route of showing a lot of the hardships and suffering that Alice and Vera would have gone through at the hands of society during that time. This movie doesn't do that, and I actually love that it doesn't do that. But why? Why does it not do that?
That was a really conscious choice. Because I feel like so often when homosexuality is depicted on screen, or when stories about people of colour are depicted on screen, they are limited to stories where that is the focus of the story. This is a film where the central gay love story, which is a period love story, doesn't rise and fall on whether it's possible to be gay in that period and how difficult it is to deal with your sexuality. It's about the things that affect everybody and the universal themes. So the reason why the two women break up isn't because it's terribly difficult for them to be gay in the face of the criticism that they get from the outside. It's about the fact that they want two different things. And my observation of my gay friends, of which I obviously have many coming through the theatre, is that, you know, to be in a gay relationship is as multifaceted and as complex and as a straight relationship. And I think it's really, really important that if we're to accept people more, and that if we're to sort of support people loving whoever they want to love, which I feel very, very strongly about, then in order for people who might be naive about that to learn about, you know, and to accept people of all persuasions, you know, it's really important that we tell all of those stories, and that you can have two gay characters in a film where the theme isn't ostensibly only about that aspect of their lives. And that's the same for me in terms of the fact that it's an interracial relationship. It's not the focus of the story, because actually I really, really, really want to see stories about people of colour which are not just about race. And there are so many fantastic actors of all backgrounds. If we limit actors of colour to playing in parts that are only stories where race is the central theme, then what a shame. You know, that's how it's been for a long time, I feel, and it's made me really sad. And I feel like you should be able to cast everybody in every role, and as somebody who lives in a really multicultural part of London, I really, really want the local people around me to be able to come to the cinema where I, you know, at the end of my road, and to see films where they see themselves on screen in every film, in the same sort of level of diversity as you see in real life. And I think we have to work much, much harder to make that happen. And I hope that it's not doing any sort of disservice in terms of the reality of how difficult those things would have been at the time. That is something I was very conscious of, but I just thought, you know, we have to start telling these stories and not make that the central premise if we are to normalise, you know, diversity on screen, which I think we need to.
Yeah, I mean, beautifully said. So when watching this film, I sometimes we get a bit of a sense of Douglas Sirk, or maybe even Todd Haynes. And I was wondering if these were influences, or were there any influences at all? I know this is an original story, but I'm wondering if there were any other influences.
Oh, that's a good question, actually. Not really specifically. Funnily enough, when people say, you know, I shouldn't read comments on YouTube, but I always do. It's the same with plays, and people always say, oh, this seems really based on XYZ film or story. And I think, oh, that's funny, because I never read that ever. You know, and the reason why I say that is because I feel like what happens when you're a writer and a director is that rather than there being one or two, for me, rather than there being a particular couple of people who are influences, I've got hugely eclectic taste and probably slightly too wide-ranging. And so rather than borrowing from one person or one tradition specifically, I feel like the things that have influenced this film are everything from the sort of culture of seeing mummers plays when I was on holiday as a kid in Cornwall, and sort of looking at scarecrows and thinking, what's that? That's really strange. It's sort of more about observations about weird English culture, and actually films like The Wicker Man, which made me think, oh, it's sort of simultaneously sexy and mysterious and weird. But also novels. Like I love magic realism, and Gemma and I are actually working on a story at the moment. We're doing our next project together, and which is sort of based on a magic realism tradition, which has really made me sort of take note of the fact it's something that's always appealed to me. And I think that's because as an artist, you love the idea of there being something a little bit more magical than what really exists. So it's probably more novels, actually, for me, books like The Time Traveller's Wife, which I loved, about the possibility of something beyond, or particular characters like Scout, for example, in To Kill a Mockingbird. I always loved young protagonists, and sort of a meeting of lots of different things. My mum was an English teacher, so I was probably more au fait with novels than I was with films growing up, because we didn't have a TV for a very long time and I wasn't allowed to go to the cinema. So yeah, I think stories were the influence.
Excellent. I'm about to go to Patreon questions. My last one before that is, though, during these current times, movies about loss and love and human connection hit different these days. They have a bit of a different sort of resonance than maybe before. And I just think that that's a really interesting point, because when you wrote this movie, when you shot this movie, it was a different world. And I think it's a very interesting thing to, what does that feel like to you to know that this movie would have resonated regardless, but resonates in a different way now?
Is that a question to me?
Anyone, honestly.
Just to briefly speak for myself, I sort of have made it my purpose to tell stories that have a seam of optimism and hope. That's probably the only thing that ties all of my work together, and it always has. I've always valued sort of entertainment and a brightness and heart really at the heart of what I want to do, and I think that there's absolutely a place for sort of searing political dramas and bleak tragedy. That's just not me. I'm never going to tell those stories. I leave them to the people that want to spend their long days writing that stuff, and then I will enjoy it as a consumer. But I think one thing that was important was that I lost my father while we were making this film. And when I wrote it, I didn't know that he was ill, and I've always wanted to entertain, and I've always thought that it was such a shame that we sort of somehow put tragedy on a pedestal as the most important, sort of the most worthy form of art, because I've always thought, I don't really agree. I feel like something that can move you and that has heart and drama in the arts, those stories are really, really hard to tell. It's very hard to make people laugh and to make people cry as well, and there's a real place for that. And when he was really ill, he very specifically stopped wanting to watch anything that was too negative. He really wanted to watch stories which would uplift him and give him hope and brightness, and he knew he had a very limited amount of time, and he wanted to fill it with stories that made him feel good and remember all the great things in the world and the possibilities of, you know, a life however short. And I thought at the time, well, that's what I want to do, is to make stories for him, and for people in that position. And what I obviously had no idea at the time, that would then be the experience, in one sense, of everybody, that we would all suddenly be reminded of how short life was and how precious it is, and how much time we've spent sort of worrying about the wrong things, when actually we should be focusing on being kind and being supportive and valuing the underdogs in our society. And so I feel like I made it for me. It became something that I made for him and for people having that experience. And then weirdly, completely unexpectedly, that turned out to be nearly everybody around the globe. But I mean, that to me is a testament to the fact that that's what that is a valuable reason for making art. Like, if you can uplift people a little bit, then that's worthwhile.
I love that. That ties directly into a question I had, but I will honor the patron questions and ask. Someone asked, what was it like to work with Frank and the other children in general?
Gemma?
Yes. Sorry. Yeah, I mean, it's always a challenge. When you know that there's children in the script, it can go one of many ways. But we were really lucky on this one that there was a long and lengthy process to find Frank and Edie. And it was really important. And Jess, you did do workshops with them to see how they took direction and how they responded. Because particularly Lucas, who plays Frank, he's in most of the film, and we didn't have the longest amount of time to shoot, and we were very pressurized time-wise, and he needed to be focused the whole time, which he was just amazing. Very, very, both Dixie, who plays Edie, and Lucas are really mature for their age, like most children nowadays, I guess. So they were always professional, always knew all their lines, always were really focused. they took it seriously, but not too seriously. They were having fun and were really actually just lovely to work with, just a real pleasure. I've worked with children before where if they were a bit younger, it becomes quite difficult if you're doing heavy scenes or you sort of have to kind of be very thoughtful about how you're going to work with them so as not to damage them or upset them, whereas they were just at the right age where they absolutely understood what was going on, and that was a great relief. But they were amazing. They were just, weren't they? They were so brilliant.
Yeah, it was a real, I feel like I could put money on the fact that those two will be a Sir and a Dame in 50 years. And we had Sir Tom Courtenay in our cast, and I'm absolutely convinced we're going to get a Sir Lucas Bond, because not only the most tremendously talented kid, well, he's now a teenager. It's weird because we shot 2 years ago, so I'm pretty sure he's about a foot taller now, and his voice will have broken, and we'll all be a little bit brokenhearted that small Frank is no longer with us, and he's grown. But it's a tremendous risk writing something with a lead part for a small kid. And I did worry that I had really dug a massive hole for myself by doing that, because it's so unpredictable and you really don't know until you're on set. But we auditioned loads and loads and loads of kids, and it was quite obvious, actually, not necessarily because of his experience, because he didn't have very much, but because of his curiosity and his brightness and the spark in him and his intelligence. And not only was that something where I thought, I know that we can work together, but it was also, those are qualities that good actors have. And he's so generous and so sort of buoyant, and also really game, which is really important. When you can just throw something at someone and say, well, try it like this. And he was always up for it. But credit to the actors he was working with, and Gemma in particular, as she was in almost every scene with him, to watch him watching her, and Gemma was really generous with her time in terms of teaching him quite specific sort of technical skills and giving him lots of tips, and watching them work together was really great, to the extent that by the time we finished the movie, I'd sometimes look round and think, oh, he's doing that Gemma trick before the scene starts to get into mode of character, and think, oh yeah, you've been learning from the pros. Yeah.
You mentioned Tom Courtenay, and that is a question someone brought up. They said, what was it like directing and acting with Tom Courtenay? They also wanted to know if the evacuation letter ending up in Alice's mailbox was orchestrated by Vera.
Yeah. The second part, that's very easy to answer. Yes, it was. I hope that's obvious, because there's been a couple of questions in sort of people asking on Twitter and in reviews to say, oh, what a big coincidence. And I thought, it's not a coincidence. I feel like that's clear. Maybe it's not. But Vera absolutely orchestrated that. She works at the ministry, and maybe that's a British thing, but we know that the ministry means the government, and that was who was organising the evacuation. I mean, Googs, I don't know if you want to talk any more about that as your...
Oh no, I mean, I always saw it that was completely deliberate. That was sort of a love letter, really, in a sense, putting those things together without spoiling it too much for everyone, or if anyone hasn't seen it. But yeah, I absolutely saw that as Vera's intention, and as you said, like the ministry being where she's working, that she has access to all of that information, and completely intended for that to be where Frank ended up.
Yeah. And as for Tom Courtenay, I mean, he's a legend, really. So do you know what was quite interesting was that it was wonderful working with him, but we did we knew he wanted to do it, but with someone like Tom, it's quite a lot to take on a new movie, because he was already working quite hard. He was doing the Eddie Redmayne film about the air balloon, and he didn't have a tremendous amount of time. So Gemma and I went round. Do you remember, Jem? We went round for soup at his house and to do our little persuasion and to make sure that he decided to say absolutely yes to agreeing to do the movie with us. And he's such a gentleman, but he does have a wonderful, massive dog called Stanley. And I think the fact that Stanley took to Gemma and I meant that Tom trusted us, because he seems to think that anybody who gets on with his dog and who likes his dog is a good soul. And yeah, he's a wonderful, wonderful actor, and I felt like it was a huge privilege to have him in the cast. But what's lovely about those older actors, and you realise that that's a reason why they've worked for so long, it's not just because they're talented, but it's because they're kind and generous, and they're a really great presence on the set, and they have time to look after younger actors like Lucas and Dixie as well. And I think that's, you know, why they've had such long careers, actually, because they're people that you want to work with again and again.
Yeah. I have two more questions. They are both for all of you. And Jessica, like you were saying, your dad just wanted to see a lot of comfort films near the end. And from personal experience, every time I've been grieving, that's what's kept me going. And during this time, that's what kept a lot of people going too. I would love to know if each of you have a comfort film.
One film. I don't know.
It's hard.
When lockdown started, I only wanted to watch 90s movies. Like, I only wanted to watch movies that I'd seen before. Either they were like Richard Curtis movies, or like stuff from the 90s that was just like a period piece, like Gladiator or something. You know, like something that I didn't need any surprises. Like, the world is already uncertain enough. I want to see films from like my childhood and my teens that, you know, not that are predictable, but just somehow there was a comfort in that the good movies. Like I rewatched The English Patient again the other day, and I was like, oh my God, Anthony Minghella, like, oh my God, like The Talented Mr. Ripley, you know, those kind of films that those grown up, sophisticated, but like, you know, grown up dramas that are, you know, harder to come by these days, I think. Yeah. I just find really
beautifully made films that are, for me, if Emma Thompson's in it, Emma Thompson is my absolute heroine. I'm going to carry on saying this on every Zoom until she wants to do a film with me.
I watched Sense and Sensibility actually as well early on in lockdown. That was on the list. Yeah,
I was about to say my comfort film, if I had to do my desert island film, if everything was going to be washed away apart from one film, it would probably be Ang Lee's Sense and Sensibility, which Emma Thompson both rocked my world in and wrote the script in, because I think it's such a beautiful, beautiful movie. And as someone who, I've just done an Austen adaptation myself, and I've been wary about doing that on screen for quite a while, because she did such an incredible version of that story that I feel like for a long time nobody would touch the Austen world again, because she just, how could you possibly better it?
Gemma, do you have one?
Yeah, I'm just thinking about it, and actually it's all of the 1960s magical children's films like Mary Poppins, Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, Bedknobs and Broomsticks, all of those films. And I just realized, like, that's where my fascination with magic realism comes from, because they're all about magic, and they're all set, they're so realistic, but then all this magical stuff happens and you just accept it. And those are the films I come back to time and time again, never get bored of, ever.
All great choices. So my last question brings it back to Summerland. As you've said, to Summerland, and it's said in the movie, is there's a lot about finding the magic and the love in the here and the now, and finding your version of Summerland. So what is your version of Summerland for each of you right now?
Tiffany, you ask such good questions.
They're really deep.
Good Lord.
Oh my God. What's
I have to
fascination
say,
is
like, you know, in this time as well, when we've been away from like friends and family, and you know, being back in the UK is very special to me, you know, and Oxfordshire, which is where I'm from. And, you know, I think you appreciate these places that maybe you took for granted when you were young, you know, places that seemed stuffy and boring. And actually you're like, wow, this place is magical and amazing. And, you know, being able to, you know, like the film itself, you know, I think that the idea of being an evacuee is, you know, being away from our parents, being away from, not being able to see your parents for all this time. I don't know, I just feel like there is something very, very special about the British countryside, and, you know, having been away, I really do appreciate it more and more.
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
for me, Summerland is not only a notion of heaven, but in the film it becomes, that is what it is literally. It's a pagan version of heaven, so it's to do with where the dead people are and how they connect with the living people. But actually it becomes more than that in my head. In the film it becomes, is that a dog behind you?
Yes.
I'm so sorry. It was just, it looked like a dog just grew out of your shoulder. Just literally. I'm so sorry to interrupt that in the middle of a flow of a question, but it was really funny. The Summerland to me in the film represents a sort of ideal of what if something perfect could exist, what that would be. A place where you could go that would make you feel reassured and happy. And for me right now, the thing I really miss is sharing my table with the people I love. And I like nothing more than having a group of people around for dinner. It's something that my boyfriend and I do a lot, and we haven't done now for months. And if I could just have a big dinner with some really nice wine and all the people I love the most just sat around, doesn't matter what the food is, we just have some drinks and have some company and be able to hug each other again. That to me, I had no idea how precious that was, because I didn't know that that was something that we would ever lose. But just having a group of friends and being able to be in the same room, that's, who knew that would be such a fantasy. But you know, wow, this time makes you appreciate that sort of thing. You're all invited. I'm maybe not 38 participants on the live Zoom. That's a very big kitchen, but you can try.
And Gemma, do you have a Summerland?
Yeah, I'm glad everyone else answers before me, because it gives me time to think. I think mine's nature. I live in the city, and during lockdown I was craving just forests, and you know, just being able to look out and just see the nature. I mean, this is something that we take for granted so much when you live in, you know, in a built up place. And I think that's the place where I really feel actually the most connected to the world. And you know, lockdown's been amazing for me in terms of my relationships with people, because I've connected more in a weird way. But that's the thing that I felt I needed to, like, and that's where you sort of, I don't know, it's magical in a way when you go to somewhere that you feel you can just be there on your own and it can nourish you. So yeah, that's mine, I think.
Yeah. Well, given that, thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you to the patrons, Lincoln Center. Enjoy, congratulations on this film, and especially congratulations on the fact that in the UK, people get to see it in theaters. We are jealous but happy for everyone out there. And everyone
about that, because there's an understanding that it's not available at all in America, but actually there's over 100 screens that are now finally reopening, and they might be in random places, but you can see it on an actual screen in some parts of America and also across the world, in case there's people listening from other parts of the world. So you know, just to support those local independent cinemas too. I hope everybody's watched it through the Lincoln Center, but if you want to see it again, then you might be able to find
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, thank you all so much for joining us, and I hope you all have a great night. Great rest of your night.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Tiffany.
Thank you.
Thanks, bye.
Bye.